It's also worth noting that fuel importers have not reported any orders being diverted or cancelled. If that changes, we will let you and New Zealand know. Fuel companies are also sharing their forward cargo plans with our officials on a confidential basis. Officials advise me that as of today, companies have a good level of confidence in fuel orders out to the end of May. However, we do have to be prepared for the possibility of fuel supplies being disrupted if tankers are unable to pass through the Strait of Hormuz for an extended period and refineries are producing less fuel. Therefore, we are today going to update you on the work government and industry have been doing to give effect to the National Fuel Plan 2024. The purpose of the plan is to minimise disruption and to help ensure everybody has the fuel supplies they need. The Fuel Response Plan 2026 that we are announcing today, that officials and industry have been working on, operationalises the concepts envisaged in 2024. It is designed to be measured, proportionate and grounded in evidence. It is deliberately flexible. We will be transparent and work closely with fuel importers, business and other sectors of the community to adjust to changing circumstances. The plan consists of 4 phases. Decisions about movements up and down between the phases will be made by the Fuel Security Ministerial Oversight Group, taking account of the following assessment criteria. These assessment criteria are important because these are the indicators we will be monitoring before we decide to convene and take an assessment about moving up or down a response phase. We are sharing them transparently with New Zealanders so they can have a sense of what to expect. They are: 1, any export restrictions imposed on any of the refineries from which New Zealand imposes fuel. 2, changes of more than 3 days to fuel stock levels since the last published update. I note that such a change has not occurred to date. Advice from a fuel company. Number 3, advice from a fuel company that it is unlikely to be able to fill future orders. Number 4, a breach or a notification of an imminent breach of minimum storage obligations. Number 5, significant policy changes in Australia or from the International Energy Agency. And finally, a significant disruption to regional distribution of fuel within New Zealand. Assessments will be informed by feedback from the industry. That is to say, if we decided to start an assessment, a formal part of that assessment will include engagement with industry. The government will be working with the industry, not dictating to it. Different fuel types could be at different phases of the plan if stock levels diverge. It could be possible that we move more rapidly to a phase in the plan for one fuel than for another. So let me go through the response phases. At phase 1, where we are currently, supplies remain normal, non-disrupted, and the government's role is to focus on monitoring fuel stock levels, to work closely with industry and international partners, to publish regular updates so New Zealanders have accurate, up-to-date information, and to advise on ways people can reduce their own fuel bills. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. At phase 2, supplies would be continuing to flow, but there would be a heightened risk of global or regional disruption developing. At phase 2, the government would strengthen public information, encouraging and promoting voluntary fuel conservation measures, giving greater consideration to regulatory tools to improve the flow of information about fuel consumption. That is, working with industry and making sure that any information we can't get voluntarily, we would be prepared to regulate for. Stepping up measures for fuel reduction in the public sector and working with fuel companies to ensure the effective regional distribution of fuel. In preparation for a potential phase 2, we have directed the Public Service Commissioner to work with all government agencies to develop a public sector fuel plan. This includes identifying their essential fuel requirements, for example, school buses, hospital heating, but also to actively develop options for government agencies to minimise discretionary fuel use. This includes things such as Defence Force training. At Phase 3. Phase 3 is a phase that we wish to avoid because we fully acknowledge it would be disruptive to the economy, to jobs, incomes, industries and lives. Phase 3 would only be necessary if supply had tightened very significantly and we judged that fuel needed to be prioritised. If that occurs, the government will work with fuel companies to ensure fuel is directed to life-supporting and economically critical services, such as emergency services, hospitals, food supply chains, and essential infrastructure. The goal in this phase is to ensure that fuel is distributed to prioritised industries in such a way as to minimise disruption. It could also be necessary in this phase to introduce temporary purchase limits to help keep fuel available for everyone. This step would be regulated by government, but implemented by industry. That is because industry know their customers and supply and delivery structures best. In Phase 4, this would be the most advanced phase of our response, and it would be because of a severe and sustained disruption affecting fuel supply. In that case, the government would prioritise uninterrupted supply to life-preserving services, and we would more strictly direct how fuel is distributed to other customers. These measures would be lifted as soon as conditions allow. And I want to be clear that the assessment criteria outlined at the beginning will equally be applied in order to see when we can move down a response phase. We are now in a phase of actively consulting with industry, local government and other community stakeholders about how we give best effect to Phases 3 and 4, including the prioritisation of priority groups. We have the gift of time and we are working with those who would be affected in those phases to ensure we get them right. We have today published our initial thinking on prioritisation bands, and we now will be consulting with those impacted by those to ensure we get the details right. Indicatively, those prioritisation bands are: 1, life-supporting services. This includes things such as emergency services, courts, prisons, hospitals, lifeline utilities, and essential defence functions. 2, economically important services, such as road freight for supermarket and grocery supply chains, international air links, food supply and primary production. 3, essential services such as public transport, essential infrastructure maintenance, rural GPs, district nurses. 4, other commercial users, and finally, general retail sales. Those wishing to engage more directly on these priority bands and the details of them will either be engaged via MBIE's formal consultation with industries and peak bodies, but if you have not been engaged in that consultation, we have set up an email address, prioritybands@mbi.govt.nz, and that email is available on MBIE's website. Finally, before I hand over to Shane, I can tell you that the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority is tomorrow launching an information campaign giving Kiwi people and businesses advice about how they can reduce their own fuel costs. The campaign will consist of tips about things that motorists can do right now to reduce their own fuel costs. These include sensible, common sense things like checking tyre pressure, driving at steady speeds, reducing idling, lightning loads. ECA estimates that doing all of these things can reduce people's fuel consumption by up to 20%. Let me be clear, this is not a case of the government telling people what to do. It is a case of providing practical information that people may want to use to save fuel and money. The campaign will start running on social media and radio tomorrow and will roll out over the coming weeks. I'm going to show you some of that campaign now when I found my doodaki. Okay. So the key thing with if you give me this, then we can do it. We can do it. Thank you. So the ads are based on the idea of stretching every tank by up to 20%, and then they will give practical tips for how that can be achieved. So, for example, you can see in that ad, idling uses fuel, switching off can save you up to 5%. And then tips available for how to stretch every tank. So those ads will run over the coming days, and they are designed in the first instance to provide New Zealanders with information about how they can conserve their own fuel use. If we were to move to phase 2, you would expect that this advertising campaign would step up another level, which is to say, excuse me, it would become more directive. This is a great time to hand over to Shane, who's going to talk a bit more about supply. Thank you, Shane.
Yes, well, the matua never loses his voice. So, obviously, there's a balance to be struck. Just to give you some monetary context, we bring in about $8 billion worth of fuel every year. Just in diesel, we chew through about 12 million litres a day. We derive that fuel from refineries such as Singapore, where nigh on 34%, according to this document which we got done several years ago. We are absolutely confident in the quality of the data we are receiving from the fuel import companies. They are regularly updating what they are in the business of contracting, what is being filled in the various Southeast Asian ports, and what's on international waters, what's in our sovereign waters. But our focus not only is about demonstrating to the public that we've been proactive and we have a level of preparation which is being completed in a collaborative way so we avoid the perfidy of COVID, but we will leave no stone unturned to ensure that we can secure the necessary supply in collaboration with the firms that we rely upon to bring the fuel to New Zealand. It's really important. Kiwis are adaptable. Kiwis are also expecting to see a level of planning. And not only planning, as I say, on the demand restraint side, but confidence that we stand ready and willing, if necessary, with the Australian government to address any unexpected issues pertaining to the supply. Thank you very much.
Minister, do you risk confusing New Zealanders? You've just spent the last few weeks with the National Fuel Plan. People have been learning the 4 levels and now you're introducing 4 new phases that don't really align. Kiwis going to be confused by this communication?
No, I don't think so. I think the 4 phases do correspond with what's anticipated in the 24 plan. But obviously this is a specific crisis. The National Fuel Plan in 2024 imagined a range of different circumstances in which fuel could be constrained, anything from a civil emergency, a weather event, through to this particular issue, which is disruption of global supply chains arising from the conflict in the Middle East. So it's appropriate that our plan responds exactly to the crisis that's unfolding in front of us. And we wouldn't be serving New Zealand as well if we stuck to a generic framework when what's needed is a specific response. And by sharing this information in this way at this stage, we're giving everyone a lot of time to digest it, to understand it, in advance of undertaking these assessments or moving up through the response phases. So this is deliberately an approach that is open, transparent, and allows for engagement.
Why is the oversight group making the decisions around moving up and down the raft?
Because we recognise that we may need to do that at pace, and of course Cabinet meets on a weekly schedule, and so Cabinet made the decision to delegate those responsibilities to a group of ministers. Yes, he is part of that group.
You mentioned in the first answer to Jamie about
I just want to acknowledge the impact those weather events are already having on communities up and down the country right now, but also acknowledge that NEMA, the National Emergency Management Authority, is very practiced and effective at working with communities through those weather events to ensure that they have the essential supplies they need. So it is our expectation that in the same way that during normal weather events you see NEMA working with communities, that as part of these response phases, that they would anticipate in any weather events that we would be prioritising support to NEMA to ensure that we could keep getting fuel to communities as required. No, they have not advised us of that, but we have made very clear that we would want to be advised early, and of course we have already got a clear expectation of the fuel companies that they would not allow any of that disruption to occur. We now have set up an implementation team at MB for the implementation details of Phase 3 and 4. NEMA is a critical part of that implementation team. They have extensive experience in working with communities to implement changes of the sort this plan envisages.
The six criteria that you have to assess whether to move up or down a level, do all of those need to be implemented before you move, or is it just one?
No, if any one of those criteria was to shift, that could prompt an assessment. I want to be clear that having an assessment does not necessarily mean that there would be a preempted decision to shift level. That's why we would look across all of the criteria, but a shift in one of them would trigger an assessment. Yes, so I expect that you would know straight away that one of the assessment criteria had been triggered. That's why we're being open and publishing them so that New Zealanders would know, well, that's one of the things that triggers an assessment. Then what we would expect, and we would confirm, yes, we are going to conduct an assessment. Then we would expect that there would be at least 2 working days until we conducted that assessment, for the simple reason that the assessment requires 2 things. One of the steps is that we do engage with industry to inform that assessment, and the second is that we have asked that officials provide us clear, deliberate advice before we go to make that assessment, noting that if we made an assessment to move into a Phase 3 or 4 response, that has significant regulatory consequences for business and community. We want to make sure we have our ducks in a row, T's crossed, I's dotted, and we want to make sure that process is clear, transparent and accountable. No, I wouldn't take from that we are incredibly wary about it. It's instead the case that what we would anticipate that as we move into a further phase, people might make their own choices about working from home. And as we would move into a second phase of an advertising campaign, there could, you'd envisage, be some encouragement to employers to consider allowing their staff to work from home where that makes sense. There is one place we draw a line, though. We do not want to see children outside of the classroom as occurred during COVID. We do not want to see children forced to learn from home. We think maintaining access to schools through all of these phases is essential, and the Ministry of Education are working actively on plans to ensure that. This generation have already had years of learning disrupted by the COVID experience that had a marked impact on their achievement, and we will be taking every step necessary to keep kids learning in the classroom. Sorry, I'm doing that thing where I have to pick someone. Go for it.
What are some of the other demand reduction efforts that could come in Phase 2?
Well, the demand reduction efforts would vary from industry and from households. From households, you could expect that in a Phase 2 we might promote more use of public transport. We might promote carpooling as a mode of ensuring that reduced travel. We might suggest that taking discretionary road trips wasn't the best idea. There could be a range of measures, but I'm clear that with our officials that they need to be evidence-based. So any measures that were to be proposed need to be based on clear evidence that they would actually have a concrete effect in reducing fuel use. For industry, you might consider slightly different measures, which would be things like there are regulations in place that, for example, restrict when truck movements can happen in CBD areas. We might actually relax some of those regulations, noting that trucks might use less fuel if they were able to run their schedules differently. No, we're not at phase 2 now. We've now published, because we are now publishing these assessment criteria. We have judged that we are in phase 1 now, but if you see a change between now and the future against these assessment criteria, we will transparently trigger an assessment, and it is perfectly possible that that will occur. Benedict? Yeah, consistent with what I told you about the development of a public sector fuel plan, we've asked them to, in the first instance, identify where priority fuel use exists for them. So obviously they already provide a range of bus services which are critical and would need to continue in the event of any move up through the phases. So we've asked them to quantify what that looks like, what their requirements are, and to consider what additional services may be needed in an instance where parents may not be able to take their own children to school. We've also asked them to look at whether there's any discretionary fuel use that they have that would be less necessary in future. So they're doing that work and just considering what would it take to keep kids in the classroom during these response phases.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to bore you with details. Do read that document. 38% of what we derive from Southeast Asia comes from South Korea. The fuel companies have not once confirmed with us that they believe that they're going to suffer any supply problems. They are sophisticated. There are 3 very large refineries in Singapore. One of them produces 500,000 barrels a day. We chew through about 50-odd million barrels a day. We have never had one single report, either in the discussions that various ministers have had with the leaders of those countries, that we are going to be either caught short, we are depending and we are trusting what the fuel companies say. And I want to say something else in terms of localised problems. The logistics responsibility for delivering fuel, whether it's in the face of a flood or a big family event, will lie with the owners of those assets. It's only when they indicate to us that there is an insoluble problem that they have in their midst, then obviously that will kick off an assessment. So I repeat again, it does take 18 days for a ship to come from South Korea, 16 days from Singapore. We are advised that there are ongoing problems with accessing feedstock, but none of the fuel companies have given us any cause for worry in terms of what Nicola has already said, what's in the country, what's in our sovereign waters, what's on international, and what they're confident they are contracting. Yep, so the International Energy Agency, by the way, is complimenting New Zealand for acting in a proactive, well-prepared way. Secondly, we did redeem 10 days' worth of options. We have 40 days' worth. The Minister of Finance and I are taking advice from the officials as to what is the most efficient and effective way to use those options to bolster a buffer for New Zealand. We will take that advice after, no doubt, the officials have consulted the existing import companies, and if another strategy is needed, that matter would need to be discussed by Cabinet.
How much was that worth?
Pardon?
How much was that worth, the tickets that we did there?
They're options to buy, they're not actually fuel that we own.
We have an option that we can call on. The fuel is stored either in Japan, the United States, and I think the UK. There would need to be some internal trading because some areas do not have the capacity to immediately process crude unless it's from the right location. But we're getting that advice next week.
Henry?
Mr. Harmon.
You say that you're confident you've got supplies at the end of May, but the Asian, Belarusian, the Singaporean Foreign Minister has said that they are entirely dependent on the Straits of Hormuz. Now, how can you guarantee that there are going to be supplies at the end of May when we don't know when the Straits of Hormuz are going to open?
Yes, well, I'll leave the geopolitical things to my colleague. We, however, can base our assessments on the fact that these are large, sophisticated importers. They have vertically integrated businesses, but we are painfully aware that the Asian refineries have consistently drawn their feedstock from the Middle East. However, as Australia demonstrated over the last 72 hours, they are also capable of drawing product from the United States of America. At the moment, we get about 2% of our production from the United States of America. We get 7% from Japan. We get about 12 to 15% from Malaysia. So as we speak, once again, all the information is in this report. We're confident, based on the quality of the information that we've had from the suppliers, the importers, that they have the capacity to change the sources to effect outcomes that keep them within the statutorily liable parameter that they work in.
Last time New Zealand did this in the early 80s, a certain amount of fuel was set aside for home support workers and teams on wheels, that kind of thing. People who had to drive to support people's health. They're currently claiming that they're not getting any extra support to deal with the fuel costs they have to deal with right now. This is why it's not publicly funded sector. Have you looked at any advice, or are you considering anything to help those home support workers?
Well, first, we would consider them one of the priority groups for fuel in phases 3 and 4, to answer the first part of your question. And in terms of the increased costs that they are facing and may face into the future as a result of the price shock, that is something that the Minister of Health is looking at and that we are considering advice on, because we do fully acknowledge the impact that increased fuel prices are having on those workers.
Have you had the advice from where we're currently doing normal usage? Obviously, some people say it's running out.
Yeah, look, we've got... Yeah, it's a very good question. We've got 2 indicative sources of data on that. The first is the data from the fuel companies themselves, not data so much as their feedback, and they are reporting some increased use. I think we can all see that anecdotally, that people are choosing to top up more often. There is evidence that people have been stocking up. The other piece of evidence that we are going to begin monitoring more regularly is what's happening with light vehicle movements and what's happening with car movements. We'll be monitoring that via the Ministry of Transport. There is some evidence that vehicle movements through cars, light vehicles, is actually reduced somewhat, including for light trucks and the like, and we are just honing that data before we present it publicly. We want it to be accurate and reliable when we do so, but we will be monitoring demand patterns closely. Well, that's what we want to be able to provide you definitive and reliable information about, but there is good evidence that demand has increased in recent times. And this is where we just want to assure New Zealanders there is enough fuel in the country and will be for some weeks. You don't need to worry that there won't be enough fuel to fill up. And actually, what is clear is that when we get that stocking up behaviour, that in itself can be quite disruptive to the distribution of fuel. So we are wanting to avoid that where possible. Yes, Jamie?
Tips during cost of living crisis. At the time you were in opposition, you told News it's ludicrous. The government's using taxpayer money to send patronising advice out to hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders. These tips are already being applied by large numbers of New Zealanders. How is this being different?
Well, look, I have the same feelings about politicians telling people what to do now as I did then, and I think I shared those with you at a press conference a week or two ago. But I'm also evidence-based, and what ECA have demonstrated to us clearly is that some of these pieces of information are not well known to New Zealanders, that they can have a material impact on fuel demand, as they say, up to a 20% increase in how much travel people can get out of a tank of fuel. And it has been the advice from the experts that by providing this information to New Zealanders, both in this phase and in a more intense way in the second phase, there is demonstrable evidence that that could reduce fuel use, but right now could reduce the cost of people's bills. So this is a case of where the evidence has spoken.
Yep.
You just said before about production and looking elsewhere in order to get things from the US, Japan, etc. If we are going to end up in a situation where we're going to have to rely on countries further away, at what point do we need to start thinking about doing that sooner rather than later, given the time difference required
Yep.
to get stock here?
Okay, so where we're drawing the vast majority of our fuel right now today is within that 16 to 18 day band, whether it's from Japan or other parts of Southeast Asia where the refineries are located. The area where it's singularly further away is the United States of America, and at the moment that only pertains to 2% in this document that I've referred to. And obviously the advice that we're taking from the officials is if there is a case for us to work in a more collaborative and substantive way with the importers, then we'll do that after the importers have informed the officials and the politicians. But I'm basing it, I encourage you to read it, what historically have been the patterns. But the reality is, there's no one called Nostradamus in our cabinet. We don't know when the hostilities are going to end. So this is a chance for us not only to be proactive and put the acid on the supply companies to maintain high quality information with us.
Tom?
Just a quick question. It seems quite a large jump to go from phase 2 to phase 3. Was there any kind of consideration for, like, I guess, an intermediary 2.5?
Well, no, we want to keep this simple and clear, and we're conscious that that can make things very confusing. But what we do acknowledge is that if we were in phase 2, you would be seeing regular communication about whether or not we thought we were in any need of getting close to phase 3. Our clear goal in phase 2 would be to prevent getting to phase 3. In fact, this whole plan is based on the idea that no one around our cabinet table wants to be in a position where we have to be prioritising fuel to New Zealanders as phase 3 envisages. So by acting appropriately in phase 1 and 2, we hope to prevent that. But we acknowledge there are things outside our control relating to global fuel distribution that mean we can't entirely rule it out.
You talked about at level 2 that you would be putting out more messaging for public transport, etc. If we got to phase 2, would that be a scenario where you would say, hey, we might put some money in to make public transport a bit cheaper for people?
Well, what we've already acknowledged is that in the first instance, we have to make sure there's enough capacity in the bus, train and ferry network, and that's why the Minister of Transport has been working with the regional transport authorities. We also need to make sure that they themselves can pay for the fuel needed to operate that public transport. So I acknowledge that could come with potential increased costs to the Crown. We already put hundreds of millions of dollars of investment into subsidies for public transport each year, and we fully acknowledge those may need to increase in the future, and that if we were to take a temporary, targeted and timely approach, there may be some targeting that we take out to ensure that the public transport users get the targeted support they need. Absolutely, because that's based on the fact that we know we have at least 7 weeks of fuel right now. We know that we have a forward order book through to May. We know that our fuel importing companies are continuing to tell us that they don't anticipate having difficulties accessing fuel. So all of that gives us confidence that it's appropriate we take the next 2 weeks to get the details of phase 3 and 4 right. It would be incredibly disruptive to New Zealand to move to a phase 3 or 4 that hadn't been consulted on properly, that wasn't as detailed as it needed to be. We don't anticipate that will be necessary. Well, as I acknowledged in at the beginning in my remarks, I think that the communication yesterday from MB was confusing. I met with their data team for an hour last night, and we've agreed on 2 things going forward. One, that we are going to provide that data to you with clearly splitting out which ships are in our sovereign waters and which ships are further afield, because we recognise that knowing a ship is actually discharging at port or only a day away gives much more confidence than thinking it's 2 or 3 weeks away. And the second thing is that we've now agreed that they will share any intended communications with me and Minister Jones before publishing those to their website.
One of the things we learned from COVID when making the essential services list is there was a massive concentration around, say, supermarkets, which basically became monopolies. How much thinking is going into ensuring that any essential services still remain competitive in markets?
I love competition, and I think it's really important. And as you say, those are some of the issues that we need to keep working through with industry, because there are details of how that's implemented that we need to be satisfied meet our goals in phase 3, but don't unnecessarily compromise industry, commerce, the normal functioning of our economy and communities.
And the plan seems quite reliant on private companies giving you perfect information. Have the fuel companies, do you have confidence that the fuel companies will give you that perfect information?
Well, so far so good, but we have preserved powers, and we anticipate we could potentially use them in phase 2, where we would be prepared to regulate in order to get information from fuel companies or cooperation from fuel companies if it wasn't forthcoming. Look, the way that we've been working with them so far has been positive, it has been constructive. It's in both their interests and our interests that we get this right for New Zealanders. But if we thought there was a gap in the information we needed to plan well, or a gap in the coordination we needed to deliver fuel security to New Zealanders, we would be prepared to regulate.
I think the other thing to bear in mind, there is a duty of care upon the owners of the fuel distribution network in New Zealand. It is not the role of any MP to take responsibility on a day-to-day basis for their logistics, and they need to front up and assure Kiwis where there might be an unexpected late delivery, explain that to Kiwis, just as any other modern firm does.
You made a couple of pointed remarks towards them in terms of the distribution. Do you have concerns or fears that the companies will not service regional New Zealand?
Yesterday we spoke with one of the CEOs, and we left that meeting very, very confident. We have a just-in-time model in New Zealand. We have been assured, we have seen evidence of 4 to 6 weeks of secure supply. That is how the system works in New Zealand. We are conscious that the refineries are having to manage feedstock problems, but no Kiwi should doubt either what we're saying or the quality of information that we're receiving from the fuel companies. And if that information needs to be ramped up, as the Minister said, we'll find a regulatory way of improving the flow of the information in the event we need it.
Yeah, and I once again remind everyone, we have in law in New Zealand minimum stock holding obligations for fuel companies. These require them to hold minimum stocks of fuel either in New Zealand or in our sovereign waters. That is one of the reasons why we track fuel in country and in our sovereign waters, because it's a legal requirement that that buffer, that safety reserve, is maintained by the fuel companies. They face severe penalties if they don't meet that. So again, it's in their interests to inform us well in advance if they think there's any risk to those buffer opportunities. Yes, Joe, and then I'll come back to you, Janae.
Is it your intention, given communication
Well, yes, you can expect regular communication from us when we have information that we think the public needs to know. You'll expect the next fuel stocks update on Monday, and of course Shane and I will make comments about that at that time. Yes, Janae?
Importers made any suggestion to you that they believe there is a bunch of Russian oil that could be refined in India and brought here? Because I believe that is a pathway that has been used in the past. Would they like government to give them a thumbs up that that's something you're comfortable with?
Yes, so this is an example of how the fuel companies are already and have been deriving product and bringing product here well before these hostilities broke out in the Persian Gulf. And as the Prime Minister has said, it's product that is coming from a refinery, but it's not Russia. He's already said that.
Yes, but I think, a fuel company might be worried that they get public backlash if everyone finds out importing Russian oil. So would the politicians be able to stand up and say, yes, we're okay with Russian oil as long as it's refined?
I think that's a judgment for the fuel companies, but I think many New Zealanders want to make sure that they can still fill up their bulldozer and fill up their ute.
Minister, just further to Henry's question around the current retail demand for fuel that's been elevated in recent days, but people are not driving anymore, possibly driving less. Do you expect it to kind of come down? Is that an expectation?
Well, look, how much fuel people use depends on two factors. One, how much driving they do themselves and whether or not they take steps to reduce that fuel use. And then the second thing, how often they're choosing to fill up. And so it is difficult to predict human behaviour, and it's part of the reason why we continue to assure people there is enough fuel, so you don't need to be stocking or hoarding fuel in order to be confident that you'll be able to keep accessing fuel over the next few weeks. Sorry, Patrick? Yeah, so one of the reasons why we have acknowledged that you might move to different levels for different fuels is that jet fuel has its own specific set of issues. So we are engaging very closely with the aviation industry, noting that the needs of Air New Zealand, as you say, Patrick, are quite different from those of international airlines. In the first instance, they've expressed some willingness or desire that they would want the government to potentially be quite proactive in an allocation model if they believed there was going to be a shortage of jet fuel. Although, again, we're not currently facing a shortage in jet fuel, nor have we received any signs that we should anticipate that occurring. But were that to change, we would be actively engaging with industry. Unfortunately, they do have some experience following the issue with the Wiri pipe of having to allocate fuel, but that does mean also that there's some experience and practical history we can draw on. No, I'm not expecting that, but of course we are seeing that fuel prices are continuing to track international developments, and I anticipate that will continue. But fuel importers have been engaged extensively as we've put this plan together, have shared with us their ideas and thoughts about how to make it work.
Just quickly on this, do you have any reaction to the news this morning that Chris Hickman said a cabinet paper which showed that he did have advice about the risks of double dose continues?
Well, I think he's got some explaining to do.
Well, you're asking the wrong politician that question, bro. Rest assured, Mr. Peters and I will have volumes to say about that next week, and it'll all be negative for the person you're referring to.
We are working as hard as we can to prevent that happening, and that involves us working internationally to ensure that New Zealand has alternative choices on where we supply fuel from. It includes the steps we've outlined today in phases 1 and 2. But we recognise there are things that are outside of our control in terms of how global supply chains could be disrupted. And that is why we are working now to have a proactive plan in place that should the worst happen, we are prepared, we are ready. Sorry about the frog in the throat.